Honourable member, there's still some time left. If there are others on the 29-2A, seeing none, I'll recognize the member for Fort McMurray, Wood Buffalo.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in this chamber today to respond to the government's budget 2014 with, like many Albertans, mixed feelings. In its throne speech a week ago, this government affirmed its pledge to work with Albertans, new and old, who desire to build a stronger, modern, better province together. There are funding commitments identified in Budget 2014 that are consistent with the government's theme of building Alberta that will be well received by my constituents and therefore merit recognition in my remarks. But there is also a great deal that is missing in this budget that is important not only to the residents of Wood Buffalo, but to all Albertans, especially when we acknowledge that as much as 30% of government revenues originate in northeastern Alberta, which is home to no more than 3% of the population. As I said just 2 days ago in my response to the throne speech, in a phrase that becomes less meaningful only because it's too familiar, the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo is the economic engine of Alberta. And so I would like to preface my remarks this afternoon with a few statistics that help to illustrate what that actually means, rather than being obscured behind the foggy thinking that is encouraged by cliches. We in Alberta, our ambitions to economic diversification notwithstanding, are for the present tied to the petroleum industry as by far the single largest contributor to our envied prosperity. Oil sands production a decade ago was barely 1 million barrels per day. Production will top 2 million barrels per day in the first time this spring. In another decade, projects that have already received regulatory approval will drive production up to more than 3 million barrels of oil per day. Some analysts suggest that Alberta oil sands account for almost 10% of Canada's GDP. Rounded up because of the discontinued penny, and 10 cents of every dollar in your pocket is derived from oil sands activity. The Canadian Energy Research Institute estimates capital investment in Alberta's oil sands over the next 25 years to exceed $200 billion, equivalent to running the entire province of Alberta for 5 years under Budget 2014. That investment is estimated by CIRI to generate $350 billion in royalties and $122 billion in municipal tax revenues across Alberta. This mind-boggling economic activity helps to explain why the region's permanent population has tripled in just over a decade, and why there are as many as 60,000 people, many of them flying in and out of Alberta and paying personal income tax in different jurisdictions, who may be living in camp accommodations throughout our region. Which is not even to mention that the total camp accommodations capacity in Wood Buffalo, as of this past Christmas, reached 90,000. The province's heavy reliance on oil sands revenues, indeed Canada's reliance on the oil sands, is why our governments have become so focused on issues like market access and the bitumen bubble, impediments to our prosperity that must be solved beyond our borders. Well, oil sands growth is also why I think the Premier announced 2 years ago that the province's focus for capital investment was going to shift to include strategic economic investment to lay the foundations to grow our economy. In many ways, the spending in Wood Buffalo announced by the government since 2008 to address accumulated infrastructure deficit of colossal proportion, Fort McMurray had become, after all, the nexus of a global tempest to develop oil sands resources. It's enabled my community, and by extension, the expectations of all Albertans, only to catch up to 2010, perhaps 2011, and we have just turned the page on the calendar to 2014. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge again this government's commitment to twinning the portion of Highway 63 from Grasslands to Fort McMurray by 2016. The government first committed to twinning Highway 63 nearly a decade ago. This highway is, of course, the singular corridor for the safe movement of goods, services, and people in and out of Wood Buffalo. It's also the primary route for the arrival in Wood Buffalo of almost 5,000 modules, not tractor-trailer units, trucks carrying large loads or dangerous goods, but 5,000 modules required to construct new oil sands facilities over the next 5 years. The improvements to Highway 63 are essential to improve public safety on one of our province's most busy, most dangerous highways. However, when this government first announced its commitment to fast-track Highway 63 in October 2012, it also announced $350 million for improvements to Highway 881 and to study requirements to extend that corridor into the oil sands region across the Clearwater River. That commitment appears to have evaporated as government has grappled with declining revenues and flood recovery. I want to remind the government, however, that capital investment in Wood Buffalo generates outsized economic return that is distributed among all Albertans in tax and royalty revenues. The public return on private investment in public resources owned by all Albertans is 2.5 to 1, and that private investment will be better targeted in partnership with the public sector. This government is correct when it says that not building is not an option, even as it makes difficult choices about where to spend scarce capital. And so it would be childish of me to stamp my feet and say, "You promised," without recognizing that my fellow citizens in southern Alberta have suffered through a disaster unprecedented in Canadian history this past summer. Still, the Municipal Sustainability Initiative and Green Trip funding are not adequate to deliver transportation infrastructure in Wood Buffalo that will help to grow provincial revenues for all Albertans. And so I repeat my statement from Monday. I strongly encourage this government to embrace the innovation it champions and to explore with stakeholders the alternative delivery and finance instruments being proposed within Wood Buffalo to support the design, construction and maintenance of new transportation infrastructure essential to our continued prosperity, the very same infrastructure identified in government's unfunded Athabasca CRISP document. One among the new approaches that has been adopted by the province has been the recent land exchange agreement with the RMWB that essentially makes the municipality the province's banker. The municipality will provide bridge financing to deliver highway improvements within the city of Fort McMurray that will be repaid through the sale of Crown land to private developers. These improvements are essential in a community of 75,000 residents that had only 40 new home lots for sale last year and 2 neighbourhoods intended to welcome 40,000 new residents, but neither of which can proceed until transportation bottlenecks are removed. This Land for Roads agreement indicates the government is willing to explore its options and the exchange or sharing of assets when required to deliver new infrastructure. It may well be that the government should not pay for every new road that supports resource extraction, but government must be the enabler of a new way of doing business so that the oil sands producers, railroads and other private sector parties can make meaningful contributions to transportation infrastructure. I'm confident that the Transportation Coordinating Committee will make recommendations to this government about how to best advance essential transportation projects in Wood Buffalo through new governance and financing instruments. I am hopeful that the province will examine these recommendations carefully and determine how it is possible to ensure oil sands companies meet their socio-economic obligations in a way that ensures increased revenues, manageable population growth, and appropriate quality of life improvements for Wood Buffalo residents. I'm also pleased to have seen in Budget 2014 that the province has reaffirmed its commitment to completing the Parsons Creek interchange, which will enable residential development in the second of Fort McMurray's 2 stalled neighbourhoods to resume. It's absurd to think that the fastest-growing community in Alberta has been prohibited from welcoming any more than 100 net new residents for nearly 2 years because there were no lots available in the entire city on which to build new houses. That impasse has been broken by a willingness to do different, and I hope that the province will bring the same courage for which the residents of Wood Buffalo have waited to bear on other issues that will require courage to resolve. The next phase of the Parsons Creek interchange is to build another crossing across the Athabasca, link that road to the crossing of the Clearwater to the east, and extend that road as the beginning of a link to Peace River to the west. That project, again, will be best completed by bringing creativity and innovation to the table to find solutions to the regional transportation network with all the players in the region. Fort McMurray has also been well served by commitments from this government to build new schools and to renovate existing schools to accommodate new students arising from 7% annual population growth. Students speak up to 120 different first languages in Fort McMurray schools, making this northern city one of the most diverse urban areas in Canada. Parents, school children, and the public and separate school boards are grateful for the commitment of the province in providing suitable school facilities. My constituents will also appreciate the commitment of funding to address flood impacts and mitigation efforts for our downtown schools, which are the floodplain at the confluence of the Clearwater, Athabasca, Horse, and Hanging Stone rivers. But speaking of schools, not all is rosy on the education front in Wood Buffalo. When the province removed the mitigation measures in place for the education property tax, it failed to understand something unique about Fort McMurray. The average three-bedroom, single-family home in Fort McMurray, roughly half again as much as the same home would cost in Calgary, and twice what it would cost in Edmonton. An ordinary new three-bedroom home lists for just over $1 million. When the government went to a strict market assessment for education property taxes, it imposed a 40% tax increase on last year on our 40% tax hike, and again this year on my constituents, hardworking families who already pay more for their housing than anyone else in Canada. My constituents do not object to paying their fair share, but they do object to the effective doubling of their education property taxes in just over 2 years, especially those long-term residents on fixed incomes, or those who work in the service sector, or who otherwise do not earn high oil sands-related jobs. I have asked in the past that the full market value assessments be phased in over 5 years, and I ask the government again to respect the hardship borne by people who already pay more for their housing than anyone else in the country. 2 years is too quick. 5 years would enable folks to manage the transition more favourably. I said just last Monday that Fort McMurray was one of the 2 communities identified in August as deserving special consideration to maintain its downtown development in a potential floodway. The throne speech said the government would make firm the commitment to build community mitigation projects in flood-affected communities. The Wood Buffalo Regional Council has already introduced measures to protect Fort McMurray that will cost approximately $160 million in order to comply with the government's 1-in-100-year flood requirements. But Budget 2014 says nothing about flood mitigation for Fort McMurray, and I'm simply putting this government on notice that it should anticipate a firm position from the regional municipality which has committed to meeting provincially imposed requirements without provincially provided assistance. I'm certain that was merely an oversight, as the government concentrated its attention on communities that were more drastically affected by June's floods. But given Fort McMurray and Drumheller alone among provincial towns and cities were recognized as deserving special consideration, it is my expectation that the province will help to defray flood mitigation expenses and not expect the municipality to foot the bill alone. Government also committed to investing in better seniors' care, focusing on aging-in-place developments. As members of this Assembly are well aware, Fort McMurray has long been advocating for more than a decade for its first long-term care facility, the only such facility in a community of 75,000 people that, if it were available, would free an entire floor of our critical care hospital. I know that Alberta Health, Alberta Infrastructure, and Alberta Municipal Affairs are all in discussion with the regional municipality to bring this vision to fruition using money committed from last year's budget. And this includes not just long-term care, but the full spectrum of aging-in-place accommodations for those Albertans who helped to convert the oil sands from Canada's largest research and development project to the engine of its economy, and who are now entering the sunset of their lives. I urge this government to bring these negotiations with both the local and federal governments to a rapid close and to break the ground on this long overdue facility in the current calendar year. Back in 2010, the province took 20 townships from Wood Buffalo and gave them to Lac La Biche as compensation for oil revenues from the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range being captured in the new improvement district that would be awarded primarily to the city of Cold Lake. An $80 million net solution to a $10 million problem has been a boon to Cold Lake and Lac La Biche, but has left Wood Buffalo with substantial lost revenues that, when the proposal was first floated by the province, was supposed to involve sharing those revenues among all the affected parties. Instead, Wood Buffalo has stripped of up to $60 million in annual tax revenues, more than $1 billion over the life of the oil sands projects in the lands transferred to Lac La Biche, without compensation. The order in Council is up for renewal in 2014. At the very least, the Government of Alberta needs to re-examine this arrangement and restructure growing revenues so that Wood Buffalo, too, is a beneficiary. This province has weathered more than one storm since the global economic downturn in 2008. Alberta remains the best place to live, work, learn, and play. That is due in part to our rich natural resources, but also to the wisdom of past leaders who built this province. I look forward to working with this government over the next year to help it understand where it has missed opportunities and how to best correct its oversights, so that the wise choices we make today will be recognized by future generations in 20, 30, or 100 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with that, I'd like to move to adjourn debate.
Thank you.